In today's video, I'm going to be talking about why I still rent my home as a multi-millionaire. Now, this is something that, like, when I tell people, a lot of people say that I'm completely crazy. Why are you throwing away so much money every single month? Um, and why don't you just buy a home, right? If you're spending that much on rent, couldn't you buy a home for that price? And yeah, the answer is yes, I could, but there's a lot of things I like renting. Um, and there's a lot of context that I feel like people need to hear in order to truly have like a correct or informed opinion on this. So let me give you guys some context. I currently rent two places, right? One is our studio, one is our home, and it's quite expensive. Now, I live in California. More specifically, I live in Newport Beach, as well as Los Angeles, near Universal Studios. So, two very expensive places where homes are routinely in the twos, threes, even fours and fives millions. So, California is definitely a special place just because the price to rent ratios are really crazy here. We'll get more into this later on because it's definitely one of the big reasons. But that gives you guys some context. We're paying a lot of money in rent. Um, and we're also paying for two places. So that's context. I'm also 33 years old. Um, and yeah, so I think that's enough context for now. Let's talk about the financial reasons because trust me, you guys, like I love personal finance. I spend a lot of time like thinking about this type of stuff. And so if you're watching this and you're like, why is Charlie spending that much money on rents, right? I didn't tell you guys, but it's north of $20,000 per month. Um, why would this personal finance guy be throwing away that much money? Well, I've done the math. I've thought it through. There's a lot of what I believe to be really good reasons why I think it makes so much sense to rent in my situation. So I'm going to explain those in this video. So the first, the first reason is going to be, so if I were to buy a house here in, let's say, Newport Beach or LA, let's say I would want a house that's at least $2 to $5 million, right? And I know that sounds really, really expensive, but that's actually that gets you a nice house, like a really nice house. That's sort of how I've been accustomed to living. Um, Buying a house like that, obviously, you need to put down a huge down payment, right? So if I were to tie up, let's say I bought a house for $4 million. If I were to put a 20% down payment, this would mean that I put down $800,000 as a down payment. That's a big chunk of cash. Um, and if that money were to be invested in, let's say, the stock markets, maybe even crypto, well, not right now, but crypto in the long term, or treasure bills or anything, it could generate some pretty significant, cash flow or equity in the future. If I invested it in my business, for example, like what could that do? That $800,000 could grow 50% or more per year. So money, there's a huge cost to having that money tied up in a house. Also, okay, this only applies to really high cost of living areas. So, like if you're watching this video and you live in the middle of the US in a place where homes are usually, I don't know, like 200 to $700,000, then disregard this video. I don't think you should rent. If I were living in a place where it made sense financially to rent versus buy, or made sense to buy versus rent, I would definitely buy. And in a lot of these lower cost, even sometimes medium cost of living cities, it does make more sense financially to buy, right? Why rent for, let's say, $2,000 a month when you can buy a house for, let's say, $500,000 and have a mortgage of, let's say, 2.5K. I don't know if those are exact numbers. I'm probably a bit off on the mortgage. Depends on the interest rate. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense to buy in a lot of places. So for anyone watching though, in a high cost of living area, it usually does not make sense financially. The price to rent ratios just do not make sense. And let me talk about this a little bit more. So the price to rent ratio is the price of a home or apartment, what you'd have to spend to buy it, versus how much it rents for. So, for example, this house, right? This is maybe a $5 million house. If I were to buy this house, I'd have to put $1 million down, and then my mortgage on 4 million financed, it would probably be $30,000 plus, plus property tax, all that stuff. Let's say we're all in for about $35,000 to $40,000 per month spending on this place if I were to buy it. Now the rent is a lot less than that. I'm not going to tell you the exact number, but it's a lot less. To where if you look at the cash flow and what I could do with that $1 million, financially, it doesn't make sense to buy this house. Yes, I'm giving up, potential future appreciation. Yes, I'm giving up the interest payments on whatever that's the difference between the rent and the interest payment. It gets a little bit complicated, the math, but for me, it just doesn't make any sense. So all these high cost of living areas, the price to rent ratios just don't make sense to buy for a lot of people rather than rent. It's going to be 99% of the time cheaper cash flow wise to rent rather than to buy. And I think that is absolutely massive, especially for young people. So that math works for high cost of living areas. If you live in a high cost of living area, please keep that in mind when deciding whether or not you want to buy a place or if you want to rent a place. Usually for the same dollar amount you spend per month, you're going to get a significantly nicer place if you're renting rather than if you are buying. Okay. Next reason is flexibility, right? I like the flexibility of being able to say, okay, if I don't want to live here forever, then I can just move somewhere else. And when you buy a house, that flexibility is thrown out the door basically, right? You are tied into this mortgage. Yes, you could rent it out. It's a headache though. Usually, especially places like this, the rent is not going to cover the mortgage. You're going to be at a negative cash flow. And so it just makes it a lot harder for you to move, right? What if you don't like the house? What if you don't like the neighborhood? I'm not tied down to this neighborhood. I'm not tied down to the other neighborhood. And just gives me a lot of flexibility, which I like to have, right? Personal finance, hugely personal decision. Everyone's personal situation is different. So look at yours and think, is flexibility actually something that you value? Because if not, then yeah, you don't need to count that as one of the reasons why you should rent, right? If I had kids, I might want to buy here. One reason for that is because then I would have a more stable place, right? So for example, I have a landlord and at any point in time, my landlord can be like, hey, at the end of your lease, we're not going to renew it. So I'd have to find somewhere else to live. So that obviously is probably not ideal if you have kids. It might force you to maybe move into a different neighborhood or different school district. That'd probably be the worst. So yeah, if I had kids, maybe I would buy, but I'm single. I forgot to mention that in the context. I have a fiance, but we travel a lot. We don't need to be stuck in one place. We don't want to be stuck in one place. Next is going to be maintenance. So I've lived in a place that I owned. I've also mostly lived in places that I rented, right? So the thing is, when you have a house or an apartment that you own, stuff's gonna break, and maintenance is a huge headache. Now, I try to value my time pretty high, And when something breaks, you have to schedule the maintenance person to get it diagnosed. You have to maybe buy repairing stuff. You have to coordinate with the people to come fix it. There's just a ton of stuff, and it's a huge, huge hassle. And the thing is, with a house like this, stuff does break, right? So I would be on the hook for that. Now, when I'm renting, the landlord takes care of it. And that for me frees up a lot of time. And when you actually multiply, let's say, my hourly worth of my time by the amount of time I'm saving each, let's say, month or year in maintenance, it's a pretty massive number. And so that ties back to the financial aspect of why I think it makes sense for me to rent. Another thing is I'd rather invest my money in out-of-state properties. One, because the price to rent ratios are a lot better there. The return on investment is a lot better. The cash on cash return a lot better in out-of-state properties. And also, if you're a real estate professional, you can take advantage of cost aggregation studies on these out-of-state properties, which do a lot better. I'm getting a little bit technical, but since those properties are way more building value rather than land value, there's a lot more to depreciate, right? Here in Orange County, when you buy a house, most of the time, most of the cost is in the land, not in the property. Hence, less depreciation, less tax write-offs. So that's a huge one. I'm not a real estate professional, so I don't do this, but this would be a huge one if I could say that I was a real estate professional, or if my partner was, whatever. Yeah, overall, like I said, this is a very personal thing. And so just because I rent doesn't necessarily mean that you guys should rent as well. But I really hope that like you guys can take into consideration some of the reasons why I think it's better to rent. A lot of you watching this as well can be high earners in high cost of living areas where I think it makes sense to rent, right? It unlocks access to a bunch of different new places to live. Most really nice apartment buildings are going to be rent only. And if you love apartments, then yeah, you have to rent. I think a lot of people, they'll find themselves like deciding between a super nice apartment for rent rather or buying like a pretty rundown property that they don't really enjoy living in, where the monthly is the same amount. I just think a lot of you guys would be happier living in that apartment surrounded by young people, being able to network, all that stuff. That's what I did the last 10 years. That's why I still rent right now, although I've moved out of apartments. And we'll save that topic for a different video, which is apartments versus houses. But yeah, that's why I personally decide to rent. It makes a lot of sense for me. It might make a lot of sense for you. So just weigh the cons, weigh the pros, and make that decision yourself. I don't subscribe to the you have to buy a house thing. I think if everyone's doing something, it's not the right thing. So I try to, what's it called? Like zag if everyone's zigging, or I try to zig when people are zagging. Don't always just do what everyone's doing because they say it's the right thing. We've always been told for like the last 100 years that buying your house was the American dream. It's what you had to do. It just seemed like a standard that is like blanket statement that took, it was just too much of a blanket statement. It didn't sit right with me. So I hope you guys can think a little bit for yourself. It's not necessarily the right thing to have to buy a house and put your money into a house and become like house rich. So yeah, be a little bit contrarian. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. But hopefully you guys got some value from this video, and I'll see you in the next one.